Welcome to Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, what we're going to discuss is cells and tissues. We're going to do a little bit of review, not a lot, because you should already know all of this. So we're going to run through the review part pretty quickly, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some things that happen when disease occurs at the cellular and tissue level. So you should be familiar with these two types of cells, the prokaryote versus the eukaryotic cell. So here's our prokaryote with no nuclear membrane, does have DNA, but it's just simply kind of in the center in the nucleoid region, has ribosomes, and will have the cell membrane and cell wall. May have flagella, may have pili and fimbriae. Whereas the eukaryotic cell, represented by our animal cell here, has a true nuclear membrane, has membrane-bound organelles, has the phospholipid membrane, may or may not have a cell wall, but it will be different than the prokaryotic cell walls. And so we're going to focus primarily here on the eukaryotic cell and how it responds to diseases. So the learning objectives of Chapter 2 is to be able to make a sketch of the generalized structure of the typical prokaryotic and eukaryotic cell and to know what the major structures are of the eukaryotic cell. Explain how cells are organized into form tissues, and to be able to diagram the fundamental structure of the four basic types of tissues of the epithelial, connective, muscle, and nerve. Explain how tissues are organized to form organs, and write a general description of the three germ layers of the embryo and what is derived from each of these germ layers. Also illustrate how materials move in and out of the cell, so we'll do a quick review of cell movements across cell membranes, and list 5 processes by which cells adapt to changing conditions. We'll explain how the cell adapts to these changing conditions, compare and contrast cell injury, cell death, necrosis, and apoptosis, and explain 3 ways in which the aging cell becomes increasingly vulnerable to injury. So, cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, functioning organism. The cell is the fundamental unit of life. All cells then make up tissues, and a tissue is simply a group of the same cells that do a particular function. Tissues then make up the organs. The organs then make up the organ systems, and all of the systems together then make the functioning organism. Let me just say one thing. There is no organ system or no organ that is not affected by another organ or organ system. So if something's happening in the cardiovascular system, it's going to be affecting the nervous system, the urinary system, and most of all of the other systems as well. Any abnormality at any level can cause disease. So, basic structure and organization of the eukaryotic cell. This is really the review material. Certainly, you should remember the nucleus contains the genetic information of the organism and will direct all metabolic functions of the cell. The cytoplasm surrounds the nuclear membrane, and structures within the cytoplasm carry out directions of the nucleus. The cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life. Tissues are groups of similar cells performing the same functions. Organs are the groups of tissues then that are performing same or similar functions. And the organ systems are groups of organs functioning together in order to provide a particular function within the body. And then the functioning organism is all of the integrated organ systems together. So, the nucleus, okay, really the brains of the outfit, the cytoplasm. And within the cytoplasm, we have the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, both rough and smooth, the Golgi apparatus, the lysosomes, the centrioles, the cytoskeleton, and then surrounding the outer limit is the membrane that's made up of phospholipids and proteins. The nucleus contains 2 types of nucleic acids. It contains DNA and RNA. The nuclear membrane is a double-layered phospholipid membrane with nuclear pores that separates the nucleus from the cytoplasm. DNA contains the genetic information of the organism, and the RNA is going to be a component of the messenger transfer ribosomal and other RNAs that we find in the cell. The cytoplasm contains everything else. It's surrounded by the selectively permeable cell membrane made up of the phospholipids and contains the organelle of the cells. And this is your generic eukaryotic cell structure. So take a moment, review these. I'm going to go through this very, very quickly because, again, this should be review from your anatomy and physiology courses. Organelles, think about it. What does the mitochondria do? It makes our ATP for us. So endoplasmic reticulum, this is the highway system of the cell. It's an interconnected network of tubular phospholipid channels that communicates with the nucleus and other cellular membranes. And it comes into form with the rough endoplasmic reticulum with the associated ribosomes and the smooth that does not have the ribosomes. The Golgi apparatus is also a double membrane bound organelle that usually sits close to the nucleus. It's been called the warehouse of the cell, but it will take large molecules made by the ribosomes, the large proteins, package them, alter them, send them out then for distribution within the cell. It's responsible for synthesis of large carbohydrate molecules. It typically connects with the tubules of the rough ER. And so the proteins made at the ribosomes will travel down the rough ER into the Golgi apparatus, will be combined with carbohydrate molecules, and then part of the membrane of the Golgi will pinch off to form secretory granules. Lysosomes are the digestive system of the cell. It's been known as the suicide packet because the lysosomes contain digestive enzymes that could, if we lose the lysosomal membrane, auto-digest the cell. Peroxisomes are really a specialized lysosome that contains enzymes that decompose hydrogen peroxide. The centrioles are involved in mitosis and meiosis. They are made up of proteins. They usually sit close to the nucleus and actually will move to opposite poles during cell division to form the mitotic spindles that will eventually then separate the sister chromatids. The cytoskeleton, made up of proteins, forms literally the cell's skeleton. Forms the structural framework. It will allow the shape of the cell and even be involved in cell movements. It consists of three types of protein tubules. The largest are the microtubules, the intermediate filaments are in between, and finally the microfilaments are the smallest. The intermediate filaments typically tend to be very small but tough protein filaments that reinforce the cell's interior and keeps its shape by holding the organelles in proper position. Identification and characterization of the intermediate filaments provides oftentimes diagnostic and prognostic information, such as with Alzheimer's disease or cancer diagnosis. The intermediate filaments may actually help us determine the cell of origin of a cancer. Tissues, groups of cells that perform similar functions, and there are four major types. Epithelium, that covers the body surfaces, both internal and external. The connective tissues, which are the supportive tissues of the body. And this can be fibrous connective tissue, elastic, reticular, adipose, which is fat, cartilage, bone, hemopoietic, which is the blood, and lymphatic. Muscle, consisting of the skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscles. And of course, the nervous system. Epithelium covers the exterior of the body as well as covering internal surfaces of the body, such as the digestive system. It also will line the internal cavities, such as the pleural cavity, pericardial cavity, and the peritoneal cavity or abdominal cavity. It will line body surfaces and communicate with the outside through the GI tract, urinary tract, and vagina. Epithelial tissues also form the glands and parenchyma, the functional cells of excretory or secretory glands in the liver and kidneys. Epithelium contains no blood vessels. There is only one exception to this rule, and that is the endothelial lining of the uterus. Epithelium is actually nourished by diffusion from the underlying connective tissues. Functions, protection. That's the big one. It also is involved, though, in absorption and secretion from those different glands. Exocrine glands discharge secretions through a duct to an external or internal epithelial surface. The pancreas is both an exocrine and endocrine gland because endocrine glands secrete their product into the body fluids, primarily blood. So pancreas secretes both digestive enzymes into the small intestine, which is actually an epithelial surface. Even though it's located internally, it actually is an external tissue. And the pancreatic islets secrete insulin and glucagon directly into the blood. So the endocrine glands are discharging their secretion directly into the bloodstream. So the thyroid gland, the adrenal glands. The endothelium is a layer of simple squamous epithelium or endothelium that is going to line many, many different surfaces internally in the body. And the mesothelium is a layer of simple squamous epithelium that lines the pleural, pericardial, and peritoneal cavities. Common types of epithelium include simple squamous, which is a single layer of flattened cells, simple cuboidal, which is a single layer of cube-shaped cells, columnar, which is a single layer of column-shaped cells, and pseudostratified, which is actually looks to be stratified or layered, but every one of those cells is in contact with the basement membrane. Oftentimes, pseudostratified will also have cilia on the free surface of the cells, as well as associated goblet cells that are exocrine in function. Transitional epithelium is a stratified epithelial tissue found only lining the interior of your urinary bladder and about the distal 1/3 of the ureters. And then stratified squamous epithelial tissue, multi-layered, and is found in several surfaces, including mucous membrane and, of course, the skin. Connective tissue fibers. We have the big, strong collagen fibers, and these help connect and support the other tissues that surround the connective tissues. Contain the protein collagen, which is very long and flexible, and it's very strong, but typically does not stretch. The collagen fibers are actually, think of it as braided collagen proteins together. So it provides a very thick, strong fiber within the connective tissues. The elastic fiber provides the elasticity of the connective tissues. This is responsible for the distensibility of the arteries, and it contains the protein elastin. While not as strong as the big collagen fibers, but it's very, very elastic and therefore stretches. And then reticular fibers are also made up of the collagen protein, but these are just the single hairs, if you will, of the collagen protein. And so they form a supporting network of organs. And they're made up of collagen protein, but they're very thin and delicate. So examples, the hemopoietic, and this is the bone marrow and the actual blood itself. Lymphatic tissue, primarily made up of reticular connective tissue and supporting the lymphocytes. Loose connective tissue and dense regular and irregular fibrous connective tissue has varying degrees of fibers within each. The elastic tissues primarily made up of elastic fibers, and the reticular tissues made up of those thin, small collagen fibers. Adipose tissue is a specialized connective tissue that stores fat within the cells, and so this is our fat tissue. Cartilage, The hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage, depending upon how many of the collagen fibers they have, are found in distinct areas and based upon the functions where they are found. And of course, osseous connective tissue or bone, which is really one of the strongest tissues of the body. The subcutaneous tissues underlying the surface of the skin actually are made up of several different connective tissues that help hold the surface of the skin, the epidermis, onto the body. Ligaments are made up of dense regular connective tissue as well as tendons. Ligaments attach bone to bone while tendons attach muscle to bone. And so these need to be made up of a lot of those large collagen fibers, and they need to have a lot of strength. Blood vessel walls actually are made up of primarily elastic connective tissue, especially in those large arteries. The bronchial walls are made up of a lot of elastic tissue because they are able to expand. The trachea has elastic connective tissue as well as hyaline cartilage rings. And of course, many of these tissues will simply support the framework of the organs, such as liver, the spleen, the lymph nodes. All of these contain numerous cells that have to have something upon which to set. Muscle tissues, smooth muscle, have no striations located in the walls of hollow internal organs and the blood vessels. They function automatically, so they are not under conscious control. They are under actually involuntary control, so they're known as involuntary muscles. Striated skeletal muscle moves the skeleton. They contain striations, and they are voluntary in function. And then cardiac muscle makes up the heart wall, and they are involuntary. They resemble the striated skeletal muscles in the fact that they do have striations, but unlike the skeletal muscle, they are single-celled, similar to the smooth muscles. So they have features that are common to both of the other types of muscle tissue. Sorry about that. And we also have the ependymal cells. All of these are in the central nervous system. And the cell that secretes myelin or creates the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system is known as the neurolymnocyte or the Schwann cell. Organs are made up of different tissues integrated to perform a specific function, and almost every organ has all of the four other types of tissue. One tissue tends to perform the primary function, and the other tissues tend to be supporting in nature. So we can actually divide tissues in the organs as the parenchymal cells, which are the primary functional cells of the organ. And so the parenchyma are the functional cells, and the stroma, which are all the other tissues that form the supporting framework of the organ. So for example, the heart. The parenchyma are the cardiac muscle cells. They are the ones that provide the movement of the heart. But we also have connective tissues that help hold everything together. We also will have endothelial tissues lining the inside of the chambers of the heart and forming the valves. We certainly have a nervous system in the heart, and so all of those other tissues will be stroma. Now, where do all of the tissues of the body come from? We all start out as a single cell, the fertilized ovum or the zygote. This then undergoes mitosis and multiplies and begins to differentiate and organize to form all of the organ and organ systems of the body. The fertilized ovum will eventually differentiate into the trophoblast. This is the peripheral cells that form the placenta and other extra-embryonic tissues that will support and nourish the embryo. The inner cell mass is going to become the embryo itself, and this will give rise or will be arranged in three distinct germ layers: the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm, or sometimes referred to as the entoderm. I will use endoderm. This differentiation into the trophoblast and the embryo actually occurs at the 32 cell stage of germination. So the zygote undergoes mitosis and one cell becomes 2, 4, 8, 16. When we go from 16 to 32 cells, some of those 32 cells become the trophoblast, some will become the embryo and differentiate into the 3 germ layers. The ectoderm will give rise to the outer structures of the body, and this will include the skin, the ears, the eyes, the nose, and the nervous system. The nervous system is the first system that develops because it has to tell everybody else where to go and what to do. The mesoderm will be the middle layer, and meso means in between. And this will be connective tissues, the muscles, the bone, cartilage, heart, blood, the blood vessels, and major portions of the urogenital system. The endoderm, the inner layer, will give rise to the viscera, primarily the digestive tract, the respiratory tract, and some parts of the urogenital tract. So the urogenital tract, some parts will come from the mesoderm, some parts will come from the endoderm. And this is kind of what it looks like. So that ectoderm, again, gives rise to the external layers of the body and the nervous system. The mesoderm will form those kind of intermediate structures, skeletal muscle, bone, cardiovascular system, and the endoderm will give rise then to the digestive and reproductive tract, respiratory tract primarily. And this is just a list of some of those derivatives of the germ layer, and it's right out of your textbook. Now, let's review movements across a cell membrane. Oxygen and nutrients have to enter cells, and waste products have to be eliminated from the cells by crossing through the phospholipid membrane of the cell. This is a selectively permeable membrane. Diffusion. Diffusion is where something, usually solutes, will move from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. And so we'll see something moving from an area where we have lots and lots and lots of it across the membrane to an area where there are fewer ones. This actually does dilute the solution in the area where the solutes are moving to. We have both simple diffusion, which simply means we're going to go from an area of high concentration to low concentration with no problem. There's nothing that's going to impede the movement from the high to low. Facilitated diffusion is where we have to go through channels within the cell membrane. So we can't just go through anywhere, we have to go through a protein channel. Osmosis is where water moves from a high area of water concentration to a low area of water concentration. But this is also dependent upon what's dissolved within the solution. So really the water is going to move where there is high solutes. So if we have small amount of solutes on one side, that means we've got lots of water. We'll have high solutes on the other. It means we've got less water. Water's going to move from high water to low water, and so therefore dilute out the higher concentration of solutes. Now, diffusion and osmosis are actually what we call passive movements. No energy is expended by the cell. Active transport, however, this is where energy must be used in order to move something. This movement is from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. This requires the cell to expend energy in the form of ATP to go against the concentration gradient. Water wants to flow down the hill, not up. Can I take water up a hill? Yes, but it's going to require a carrier of some sort, and active transport will require a protein carrier in the cell membrane, and it's going to require expenditure of energy. Phagocytosis and pinocytosis. Phagocytosis means cell eating, pinocytosis means cell drinking. We're actually going to move the cell membrane. And even though there's not a great expenditure of ATP, because there is movement, this is considered an active form of transport. Phagocytosis, we inject solid particles too large to pass across the membrane. The cytoplasm literally flows around the particle and it will fuse on the opposite side, forming a vacuole containing the engulfed particle in the cytoplasm. Whereas pinocytosis is the ingestion of fluid rather than solid material. Now, I will say pinocytosis has pretty much fallen out of the vernacular because we don't say, well, we're going to sit down and eat and drink. We know that we're probably going to be taking in some fluids with the solids. And so most of the time, we just simply use phagocytosis for cell engulfment. This slide actually shows osmosis. So here we're going to move water from an area of high water concentration to a lower concentration. And that means, though, that what we're going to be doing is we're going to be moving water from an area of low solute to high solute concentration. Now, if the solute can go across this membrane, then it will go from an area of high solute concentration to low through simple or facilitated diffusion. This movement of both water and solute will continue through the processes of diffusion and osmosis until equilibrium is reached on both sides. However, what if the solute cannot move? So here I have a situation that I have water on this side and a solution over here that contains a solute. And this membrane is impermeable to the solute, but permeable to the water. That means water is going to move across in osmosis, and that's going to cause the level of this volume over here on this side to rise. And the volume over here will actually decrease because we're losing water to the other side. Now, what I really want to talk about in this chapter is how do cells adapt to changes? How do they adapt to disease? And there's some terms that we're going to talk about. Atrophy literally means the reduction in cell size in response to either diminished function of the cell, the old saying, use it or lose it applies, inadequate hormonal stimulation. So, woman in menopause, her ovaries are actually going to atrophy. The cells are going to shrink in size due to the fact that there's no hormonal stimulation any longer. Or we could actually see atrophy occurring because of reduced blood supply. Simply not getting enough nutrients, we're not going to work as well, we're not going to make proteins, and we're going to shrink in size. Some examples: reduction of the skeletal muscle size when the extremity is immobilized in a cast for a prolonged period of time. Any of you that have had a broken bone that might have been casted, you take the cast off and it looks like your muscles have just shrunken, and that's exactly what they've done. You're not using the muscles, and so the muscles go, why should I make all this actin and myosin? I'm not going to be using it, and so it shuts down the production, you lose protein, and the cell actually shrinks in size. Shrinkage of the breast and genitals following menopause is actually due to diminished estrogen secretion and other hormones, and so we'll actually see those tissues begin to atrophy. Hypertrophy, however, is increase in cell size. This is not increase of cell numbers. This is simply the cells are getting larger, and this is due primarily to more proteins being deposited within the cell. So if I suddenly decided tomorrow I'm going to start lifting weights, over time my muscle cells will actually hypertrophy and get larger because of the increased demand for work. Heart of a person with high blood pressure. It's making the muscles of the heart work harder against the high blood pressure in the arteries, and so the heart will actually get larger trying to compensate. Now, hyperplasia is increase in cell number. They will increase somewhat in cell size, but primarily what we're seeing here is these cells undergo mitosis and we simply increase the number of cells. And this is usually in response to increased demand for work or excessive hormone stimulation. Glandular tissue of the breast, for example, during pregnancy will actually undergo hyperplasia in preparation for lactation. Enlargement of the thyroid glands to increase output of hormones. So if we need more T3, T4 coming out of the thyroid, it actually will enlarge. And this is due to increased numbers of the follicular cells. Now, metaplasia, this is where tissues change from one mature cell type to another mature cell type. These are not abnormal tissues, but they are in an abnormal place. Best example of metaplasia would be scar tissue. Simply the fact that we're replacing a functional tissue with something else that's not supposed to be there. It's not, however, an abnormal tissue. For example, a chronically inflamed bladder, the transitional epithelium typically will do one of two things. It will either completely degenerate and scar, or it will actually convert to oftentimes a more stratified squamous epithelial tissue that does not have the stretchability that the transitional epithelium does. Now, dysplasia is where we see cell development and maturation are disturbed and become abnormal. And typically we can see with dysplastic cells both hyperplasia and hypertrophy, but the cells are no longer functional, mature cells. Individual cells tend to vary in size and shape. So example here of dysplasia, chronic inflammation of the epithelial cells in the uterine cervix may progress to cervical epithelial dysplasia, and this eventually can lead to neoplasia or cancer. We also can see increased enzyme synthesis in some cells, and this can be an adaptive response as in inactivating or detoxifying drugs or chemicals through a number of different enzyme systems. For example, it takes more and more alcohol for an alcoholic to reach the same buzz if we keep ingesting more and more alcohol over time, because the liver cells actually simply produce more of the enzyme that breaks down the alcohol. We break down more alcohol in the liver, we don't get the same buzz that we did with the same amount, so we need even more alcohol to reach that same level. So let's talk a little bit about cell injury, cell death, and necrosis. Normal conditions in a cell. Potassium is actually actively transported into a cell and sodium is transported out. This is the sodium-potassium pump, and this is in the normal cell. But what if something happens in the cell and that sodium-potassium pump is disrupted? Well, the changes can then result in cellular injury. What will happen is if the sodium-potassium pump is not pushing sodium out of the cell, sodium will leak into the cell through what we call sodium leakage channels. And wherever sodium goes, water is going to follow. So one of the first changes that we see with loss of the sodium-potassium pump is increased intracellular sodium and cell swelling due to increased water intake. We can also see fatty changes within the cells, where cells normally that would not store fat begin to accumulate fat droplets within the cytoplasm due to impairment of the enzyme systems that normally would metabolize the fat in those cells. We see this a lot of times with hepatocytes in the liver. Now, cell necrosis. Necrosis literally means death. It means that enough damage has occurred into the cell that we get something known as autolysis. Once the cell has crossed a minimal line of organization, the cell is going to undergo necrosis and it's going to die. All necrotic cells are dead, but not all dead cells actually died from necrosis. So cells that don't undergo necrosis that die may be actually undergoing apostosis, or you can pronounce it apoptosis. This is a genetically programmed cellular death. All normal cells have a predetermined lifespan, just as we have a predetermined lifespan. The number of functional cells within an organ is determined by the balance of new cells that are being made by mitosis and the number of cells that are dying. At some point, the cell simply says, I'm done. I have copied my DNA so many times that now it is so damaged I can no longer undergo mitosis. I can no longer take care of the functions of the cell, and the cell will simply die. Apostosis affects single scattered cells within the tissues, whereas necrosis tends to affect a much larger area within the tissues. The cells age just as we do, and so genetic, apostosis, as well as environmental factors play a role in the longevity of the cell. Aging of the cells may be caused by damage to cellular DNA, RNA, or the cytoplasmic organelles. The more efficient the cell's repair process for these damages, the greater likelihood that the cell will recover and go back to as close to homeostasis as possible. But as the cell ages, just as we do, the enzyme systems tend to gradually decline. The cell is less able to protect itself from injury. I read the obituaries every day to make sure I'm not in there so I don't have to come to work. Okay? But what I see sometimes is an obituary that says so-and-so, 104 years old, died of natural causes. And I go, what exactly is natural causes? Well, natural causes is aging. As we grow older and our cells age, we begin to lose more cells than we're replacing. And so, if you've ever heard of the incredible shrinking woman, yes, we all tend to become shorter in life. Why is that? Because our bones begin to shorten because we're not replacing as many cells that are dying. Eventually, our organ systems simply wear out because the cells are dying, and we get enough of those cells that die, and then the organism itself dies. So, on that happy note, we'll look forward to the next chapter. Thanks.